Hello and welcome to VCO2, the podcast that helps you become a smarter impact investor and a better climate tech entrepreneur. Today, we're joined by Andrew Shebbeare, managing partner at Counteract, a VC fund investing in the next generation of carbon removal entrepreneurs. In this episode, we are talking about how carbon removal companies can thrive and survive in the new economic and political reality, and how investors can help them succeed. If you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube, or give us a 5-star review and a follow on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Let's dive in. This episode is sponsored by Buresol, an AI-driven energy company transforming how businesses store, manage, and consume energy. Buresol's energy as a service model makes clean energy adoption seamless, helping industrial and SME achieve energy autonomy, cost optimization, and sustainability without any upfront investment. They are now expanding in France and Europe, and they are launching their first commercial projects. So if you want to learn more, you can find the link to their website in the description of this episode, or you can reach out to their CEO, Felipe Ariola. Back to this episode. Andrew, thanks for coming on the show. And I guess to get started, I think I'd love for you to draw a quick picture of the current economic and political environment. Feels like there's a lot happening in the world. Over to you, Andrew. Tell me.
Thanks so much for having me, Hugo. It's really great to be here. I wish you'd started with an easier question. I hope it gets easier from here on in. But I do appreciate this is an important question in the context of what we'll talk about. I'm a bit of a geeky sci-fi buff, and I think about this stuff a lot in the context of sort of evolution and where human beings might end up. And I'm slightly fatalistic, I guess, in some ways, that I think where we are today is sort of the natural result of the confluence of economic growth and disparity, the massive democratization of technology, and particularly things like social media, and of globalization. And then a lot of accelerants that come in, often technological, like AI, are sort of bringing things to a head much more quickly and much more suddenly than perhaps anyone saw coming. For me, it's that sort of those forces kind of brew a lot of effects, but one of them is this sort of feeling of mistrust that a lot of people have, and the sort of jealousy, I'm afraid, that those sorts of forces breed, and that creates, I think, a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty that people who are smart and sometimes not particularly well intentioned are able to exploit. And I've sort of put those things down, and for me, the inevitable result is a rightward shift, more short term thinking, less trust in our fellow human, and a certain amount of fear for the future. And those are really sad things. I don't believe they're terminal. I think we'll work through them, but I think they are the natural effect of a lot of the technological changes going on in society. So we're seeing a shift to the right all over the world, pretty much. It comes in different shapes and sizes, and it calls itself different things. But there is no doubt that we are a less constructive and less trusting society than we were probably 20 or 30 years ago. And we're seeing, I think, that an interesting sort of almost full circle political reality where we're seeing more commonality between some of the most advanced democracies in the world and then some of the most advanced communist states in terms of the actual reality of the policies that they're pursuing. And so, I think that's kind of challenging a lot of what we thought as Western ideals. And some of the sort of more European ideologies maybe are described now as a bit old hat, a little bit quaint, and very expensive. And so, questions about defense at the expense of everything else, growth at the expense of everything else, and maybe a little bit less emphasis on liberal democracy in the way that we thought to define it, um, has sort of become the new environment and the new reality. And I think that it hasn't happened overnight, but it has taken some of us, I think, by surprise. And I think it has implications for almost every strata of society. I mean, I live in the UK, and I woke up to the news today that 4.5 million children live below the poverty line in this country, which we think of as a rich, advanced country. And that is an absolutely terrifying indication, I think, of where we are today. We've got a relatively liberal government, and yet we're in the point where we that that poverty line is getting worse. I don't want to start the podcast on a super negative note, but the landscape is difficult. And yet we all know that the problems of climate haven't gone away. In fact, they're getting closer because some of our activity to kind of delay those delay or bend the curve has been postponed already. And so there's a sort of double whammy here, which is that it's biting hard for people already, and that the massive effects of climate are getting closer and potentially more severe.
Thank you for drawing that picture for me. I don't know if it's a good note in my day. I think it's it's gonna make me sad for the rest of the day. But
We're
let's
gonna end on a high note, I promise.
perfect. So I guess with that context in mind, you've been an investor in carbon removal technologies for the last few years. I'm curious, have you seen that context affect this type of startups because they're not top of mind anymore, because politics are not so much into removal anymore? Like what's happening there?
Yeah, it's tough. It's a lot harder to raise money for a carbon removal company this year than it was 3 or 4 years ago. Um, and in some ways for good reasons. I'm sure we'll get into those reasons in a second, but I guess in terms of the symptoms and what founders are experiencing, and raises are taking a really long time. I think it's not uncommon even for high quality companies to take 9 months to raise a round. And when, most of these rounds fund 24 months ish of runway, that means you're basically raising all the time. And that's really tough for a founder because actually they want to be building companies, not talking to people like me. It's a massive overhead, massive cost of doing business, and it's a massive emotional drain. And actually, one interesting thought I had the other day was, we used to be a bit judgmental about how quickly a round came together. Like if it was slow to happen, that was a sign that the company may not be as strong as it should be. And I don't think we make that judgment anymore at all. I think it's just normal and expected. Um, so much the paradigm has changed.
Yeah. And you mentioned the good reasons. What are those? I'm curious.
Um, the good reasons why it's more competitive, why it's more difficult. I think let's set aside maybe the level of sort of appetite. There are a lot more carbon removal companies than there were when we started Counteract. I think when we started Counteract, there were probably 2 or 3 dozen carbon removal companies in the world, and Bloomberg now thinks there are over 800. And they can't all be great, good, right? It can't all be great. So there needs to be some discrimination, and that discrimination means companies failing. It means some people taking forever to raise a round because nobody could quite get the conviction they needed. And it means that investors need to make discerning choices. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that every carbon removal company in the world deserves to exist. That's not the future. They all deserve a shot, but failure is a part of the system.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's just that this ecosystem is maturing as well over time, and therefore with more companies, it's also a bit more competitive, which I guess overall is rather a good thing. Um, I'm curious, Andrew, like within a carbon removal company, a lot of people think that what they sell is only carbon credits. That's a kind of a stereotype. Is that true? Does that story all true to you?
It is certainly not true that all carbon removal companies only survive on carbon credits. Of course, some rely on them more than others. Um, and it's not necessarily terminal to be reliant on carbon removal sales. There are a number of companies in our portfolio whose primary business is selling removals. But there's no doubt that investors are more nervous now than ever about CDR sale reliant companies. And of course, by credits, I'm sort of including a bunch of different things. There are tax credits like the 45Q regime in the US. There are emissions trading schemes like in Japan that can encompass carbon removal. And of course, there are the voluntary markets in which people will come and pay companies out of the goodness of their own heart, or because they think their shareholders or customers want them to. to buy removal credits and help offset their carbon emissions. Um, in general, though, the bulk of high value carbon removal today happens from voluntary markets. We call the VCM the voluntary carbon market. And typically, those are companies with often relatively high margin per unit of CO2 emitted who are electing or who have made pledges to their shareholders or customers to reach some level of neutrality um, to buy carbon removal in pursuit of that goal. And they tend to do so at very high prices because we're in a small market, which is extremely supply constrained and which those companies are choosing to support with semi sort of philanthropic motivations. They want to help the company succeed and scale. And the big participants in that are companies like Microsoft who dominate that market, uh, um, buying consortia like Frontier, who bring together lots of individual buyers to kind of work collectively and help catalyze the market. Those are they're quite big and fantastic activities that we kind of really appreciate because they help underpin the space, but they are finite. Right? We're talking about single digit billions by the end of the decade, probably. And while that sounds like a lot of money, it actually isn't enough to sustain an industry that needs to get to gigaton scale, and which might be worth $1 trillion by the middle of the century. What else is in there? Well, I think it varies a lot by company. Some companies are really their only business model is to sell carbon credits. A lot of companies actually have other ways of making money by making their business carbon negative, and they may or may not sell carbon credits as part of that. For us, all other things being equal, we would much prefer a company had a going concern a going concern business, which made its own revenue and profit without having to sell carbon removal, for whom that extra carbon credit is the jam or the icing on the cake. And in our portfolio, there are actually a lot of those types of companies. In fact, they're the majority. So we don't necessarily think so much of CDR companies as companies that must only do carbon removal. We look for carbon negative businesses. A great example, for example, is Crew Carbon. So Crew Carbon is a company that helps fix the acidification of wastewater. So when wastewater leaves us, whether it's from industry or whether it's from municipal waste, it's typically acidic and it needs to be remediated before it gets released into waterways. Once it's been purified and cleaned, it needs to be remediated to bring the pH up so that it doesn't do environmental harm. Historically, that's been done with caustic soda, which is expensive and carbon intensive to make in traditional methods. And Crew has pioneered a way to do this instead with ground limestone. Very simple process. They're substituting a very expensive input with a very cheap one that has a very low carbon footprint. And it happens to be that when they remediate that pH using limestone, they can also draw CO2 out of the atmosphere by increasing the alkalinity of the wastewater. And so they've got a process that replaces an existing industrial process that happens to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Another company, for example, I might mention is Concrete for Change here in the UK. They have a carrier which allows us to lock CO2 into concrete as it cures. And thanks to that carrier, they can drop into any existing process. They don't need special curing chambers or anything like some of their competitors do. But the real benefit is the concrete is stronger. And so you need less of it for the same amount of strength and to make the same building. That means you actually save CO2 emissions, you save money on the concrete, and you happen to lock CO2 away in the structure at the same time. I could probably keep going like this for quite a long time, but you get the idea. Really, the ideal is to find new carbon negative ways of doing things that we need and want to pay for.
Yeah, and I think that is a very interesting point because I think a lot of people think about the CDR company as only like carbon credit sellers. And to be honest, like as a former analyst, part of a VC fund, that was a concern for me because I'm like, what if this carbon credit market just completely fails? What if regulation changes? Like it's really outside of your control. Would you actually invest in 2025 in a company that is only doing carbon credit?
We would, and we have. I think, but we expect them to have an extraordinary advantage over their competitors. We do expect the carbon market is going to be really big, and we don't want to miss that opportunity. But let's take the example of direct air capture, for example, because it's probably the easiest example of a primarily carbon credit reliant industry. There are still ways of doing that are smarter and integrate better with existing businesses, or have alternative routes to market than the sort of first or second generation DAC companies. A really good example is that several of the companies in our portfolio, several of the direct air capture companies in our portfolio, have ways of storing energy, and so they almost act like a battery. And in doing that, they are able to use renewables off the grid when they're really, really cheap, and then operate 24/7 by kind of using that stored energy. Some of it's stored as a pH swing, some of it can be stored as a thermal swing, some of it can be stored as an electrostatic charge, and then releasing that back into their system so that they can keep operating around the clock. They're still ultimately primarily about carbon credits in that situation, but they have a massive trading advantage over a company that needs around the clock energy. Another example is several of those companies also work really well in dilute flue gas streams. So we know that traditional carbon capture installations using mostly amines typically perform quite poorly when your gas concentration gets below about 10, maybe 5% CO2. And the techno-economics are basically prohibitive for a lot of its applications. And now for that company, 5% is actually a really, really rich feed. And so those applications are really interesting go to market, which then mean that, rather than necessarily have to sell on the voluntary market, you may well, for example, help a company save money by avoiding to have to pay emissions taxes on something like the European Union ETS scheme. And then last but not least, one of the companies in our portfolio, Parallel, their process actually produces a really interesting ratio of hydrogen alongside the CO2 that they capture. And that ratio is actually just right to be able to feed into a lot of synthetic fuels or synthetic chemicals manufacturing, such that, if they're not being paid to store CO2, they could be paid to make fossil-free alternatives to anything from e-kerosene to e-methanol, which just, kind of gives them a lot more flexibility in terms of go-to-market. And actually combined with that energy storage, you get some really interesting opportunities to sort of arbitrage energy. And I think, lots of different ways to make money that are not necessarily just credits. We still value the credits. I don't mean to bad mouth them or give anyone watching this podcast the impression that, we've given up on that market. We're so grateful to the people who are actively catalyzing that and making the future of these companies possible.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting because the way you describe it, it feels like it's the second generation of like CDR is like CDR as part of a process or CDR as part of an industry. Like it plugs somewhere where there's already a process, like either you change it or like, you're part of a wider thing and you're not just that CDR company alone on your side. But maybe let's switch gears a little bit and, take a bit of a step back on that industry. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but like, is there still hype around carbon removal? Like, is it still as exciting for investors and corporates and politics as it used to be a few years ago?
I think I spotted you at least one side event at the Hello Tomorrow conference a couple of weeks ago in Paris. I didn't get the chance to say hi, so apologies for that. Put it right now. Um, but but at that event, I was reflecting because I missed the year before, but I was there in 2023, and I was reflecting on how different it felt to be a climate investor uh, in 2025 versus 2023, and there's no doubt, you know, it's very different. Like, we felt like one of the hottest topics. Everyone wanted to talk about climate, and now everyone wants to talk about defense and AI. And that's okay. I've been through a lot of hype cycles, both as an entrepreneur and as an investor. I see that they sometimes can be very beneficial, but I also see that they can be incredibly unhelpful. Um, I'd say we've got a relatively mature team that's got quite a lot of experience of kind of those waves cresting and crashing, and we were pretty careful not to get caught up in too much of the hype around CDR. We've always been looking at the companies that we invest in on their fundamentals. And we've been very mindful of the risk of some of the hype and some of the frankly overvaluations that were in the market in the early part of the 2020s for CDR companies.
Do you think you've overpaid some of your deals?
Like I said, I think we've been always very careful. We've looked at companies that, you know, bury biomass as companies that bury biomass. And that's can be a really powerful way of removing carbon, but fundamentally it is what it is. And I think we've looked at companies that farm algae as companies that farm algae. And again, like, is that worth a huge, like, stonking $50 million valuation by the time they get to the second race? No, it's not. That doesn't mean it's a bad activity. But I think we feel grateful that our very experienced team has been very cautious about some of those rounds, and I think we built a portfolio that feels extremely resilient and of very high quality. And of course, we will see failures, and of course, we've made mistakes. I certainly don't pretend to see it all coming. Um, but actually, I think coming out of hype cycles is also a really good thing. I think now we've all got the time to think hard and carefully about really thinking about risk, which is something we've always done. But sometimes that meant we were getting priced out of deals, or that things were moving too quickly for us to be able to get really high levels of confidence. And now we're able to do that diligence right, which actually suits us down to the ground. And in the long run, I think it actually suits the CDR sector really well. One of the wonderful things about the CDR community is that it's full of scientists who speak their mind. And honestly, they call BS when they see it. And I think there's a really good kind of natural self-improvement capability that exists in the space. People share insights, they share learnings with humility and honesty. And I think that's absolutely vital to the sector scaling to where we needed to get to.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, like, I had the chance to also interview someone from Carbon Removal Partners, and the feelings I had in that conversation was a bit similar to this one, which is like this community feels like they're really trying to help each other out because it's such a complicated topic anyway. It is so big, so massive. We need so many people to work on it that everybody feels like they are connected and really supporting each other. Obviously, there's probably a lot of competition between the different startups and different funds and whatnot, but it really feels like there is a community behind CDR, which I think is rather a great thing and rather unusual in the startup, lens. Um, but if we look at the years ahead, so obviously we have this hype cycle and it's going down a little bit. What are the tailwinds and headwinds that you see for 2025?
It's a great question. It's only March, and clearly already a lot has happened this year. Um, I think that, um, the way I look at it, the headwinds are real, but they are predominantly about optics. Um, they are about political uncertainty and the resulting investor and corporate uncertainty that sort of falls out of that. And they are about corporates, frankly, dialing back their commitments because they think they can get away with it in the eyes of their shareholders or their customers. Those things aren't small issues. Like, I don't want to belittle them, but they're the problems, and they're predominantly about optics. Um, if you look at the hard facts, though, there hasn't actually been any negative news, and I'm touching my wooden desk, on the policy front, either in the US or in Europe. In fact, there's been lots of good news on policy. You look at, Germany, for example, is suddenly seeing like real commitments that will actively support the CDR space. As mentioned, Japan, things are happening really quickly over there. Um, and that support is coming from all sides of the political spectrum. You know, we're seeing as much action and job creation in Republican states, in fact, probably more than we are in what you think of states that traditionally back environmental action. And the voluntary purchases that we talked about are standing fast. In fact, they're increasing their activity. And that's really exciting. I think they might be shouting about it a little bit less because it maybe isn't as cool, or at least it's not perceived to be as supportive of the current political administration. But it's still happening. Um, and I think this sounds like a selfish thing to say from the CDR corner of the climate sort of community, but every day that we slow down on reducing emissions, we need more removal, we need more repair, and we need more resilience. And actually, removal, resilience, and repair are all intrinsically intertwined for the precise reasons that we were talking about. We need to restore wetlands because that helps fix our natural ecosystems, but it also makes us more resilient to extreme weather events, and it happens to remove carbon. So things are difficult, but they are not all unhelpful for CDR. And in many ways, I think these are sort of hidden tailwinds. I wouldn't wish for this environment to have come about. But as I said earlier, I think to some extent it is a sort of natural cyclical thing. And in some ways, for me, it just increases my level of confidence that CDR is going to be a huge industry that's going to be sorely needed. And with all of that, there comes AI, which of course touches everything. One thing it does is it's going to produce more emissions because most of the growth in AI in the short run is going to be fired by gas, unfortunately. As cool as it all seems, we're burning fossil fuels to enable it. And that is going to increase the need for CCS and for removal.
Yeah, and I mean, there's no doubt for me that this is going to be a massive industry. I mean, if we like realistic, it's very unlikely that we get to net zero without carbon removal at all, right? Like it's very unrealistic to think about that option. So I think you're in the right industry. The timing is always tricky, and I guess we need more people to act. I mean, I really like what you said about the political aspect of it. I mean, I don't think any political party should be more or less involved in climate. I think it should be just all hands on deck for everyone. I don't think that's a topic that anyone can ignore. Um, but going back to your fund specifically, there are a couple of topics I would like to touch on today, which is more related to like the LP side of thing and the fund thesis. One of the aspect of your fund is obviously that you only invest in CDR company, and as such, you had a goal to catalyze 5 gigaton of CO2 removal by 2050. I'm curious, what do you stand now a couple of years later?
Well, a couple of years later is the operative word there. So, we've got a little way to go. Yeah. We started investing in 2021. So I guess it's been 4 years and a bit. And we've got 25 years to go. And we're hoping that all of these companies, the ones that succeed at least, are going to follow some kind of exponential trajectory. So we're at the very beginning, but we actually just did a bit of a stock tape on this. How are we doing against our goal? And I am proud to say we just crossed the 250,000 tons of removals sold milestone, which is really exciting. Now, clearly, that is a big number. It's a drop in the bucket um, next to our total objective. But still, like we're really excited to see the handful of companies that are now developing projects. Quarter of a million. That feels like a big milestone. We're really proud of it. The important thing, though, in our mission has always been to catalyze, not to deliver. We're not here to build huge projects that will just come and deliver megaton scale removals. We think really hard about the ingredients that will be necessary for that all to come together. And MRV, or measurement, reporting, and verification, is a really big part of that, because you have to be able to prove that delivery is real. And some of our MRV companies are also scaling up really, really fast. So they don't sell any carbon themselves, but Chloris Geospatial, which is that tagline is "Way trees from space." So they use satellite data to measure the carbon stocks in forests. They've now just passed 1.5 billion hectares under measurement. So they can measure the carbon stocks over time, basically on the entire tropics of the whole planet. And that's a completely unique capability. I think we can now say that that is a genuinely catalytic impact on forest measurement, and they're being used by pretty much all the leaders now in forestry. We work with a company called Secana, which does something very similar for soil carbon. They're just about to hit their 1 million hectares of farmland under measurement. And we also invest in a company called AgriCarbon, which does physical sampling. So they don't get to use satellites. They have to send in robot tractors to take deep cores. Of course, that's a very high fidelity measurement using dry combustion. Um, so it scales less quickly, but it's the gold standard. And they're just about to hit 500,000 hectares. So there's this really exciting moment now in the portfolio where, there are probably a dozen companies to which we can point saying they are really making a difference. And there are probably another five or six that are just about to hit that. So I mentioned Agricarb. Adaptivate is a company in the UK that makes carbon negative wallboard, so replacement for traditional drywall or plasterboard. Um, and they're just about to commission their first plant, to build a production line that's going to produce 50,000 square meters a year of carbon negative wallboard. So I love it. You can see on my face, I get excited by seeing these real world results. I think when we started the fund, it all felt sort of theoretical, and now it's getting real.
Yeah, it's quite some progress for 4 years of existence as a fund. But talking about the fund, so you've been investing for 4 years now. What are you hearing from LPs about CDR right now? Because I would assume that, like any other fund, 4 years in, you start to think about the next steps as well. So I'll be curious, what do you hear from them? Is there some appetite still for CDR?
Yes, there is. I think it's changing. It's different climate to where we were. So as I mentioned, the market's changed. We now have hundreds and hundreds of companies out there. I think what's interesting is that CDR is becoming more of a strategic focus for a lot of industrials. So it was thought of as this separate vertical. You said it yourself. Like it used to be kind of a siloed idea that you'd buy CDR from a CDR company. I think what we're seeing now is the industries are going, hang on a minute, there are ways for me to build carbon negativity into what I do. And maybe I'm going to need to if I'm going to reach my net zero commitments, or if I'm going to, pay back my historical emissions. Um, so we know that the tech companies that we talked about are all over it, and we're not even going to sort of go into that because it's obvious. Amazon, Google, Meta, Shopify, Stripe, they're the leaders in the space. But we're going into a new stream of industrials, and I think the aviation industry is really rapidly realizing that ESAF and SAFs might have a place in the mix, but they're probably not going to be able to ESAF their way to net zero for lots of simple and complicated reasons, basically because of physics. And the the CDR vertical suddenly looks like a really smart way to get involved in abating emissions that are really expensive to abate. Um, the same thing it holds true for the shipping industry. We hear a lot about new technology advances and new ways to use wind power and methanol and all that stuff. That's great. But fundamentally, kerosene is a really energy dense material, which is hard to substitute. And so we think CER is going to be really important to that industry. We're seeing automotive and transportation sectors in general getting more and more involved. The built environment, I think, is suddenly realizing that, those net zero commitments, they made it really tough, really, really hard to decarbonize buildings. Um, but they also have an opportunity, because so much of buildings is carbon, to become carbon negative or to embed carbon negative behaviors into their business. Um, and then in completely different verticals, I think insurance and asset management is getting wise to this. And so we're having a lot of conversations now with big asset managers, big insurers who realize they actually need to get wise about this because of the climate risk and the fact that they're going to be expected to be able to provide insurance products for people who've made net zero commitments and are potentially legally bound to them. So I think what we're seeing now is a much wider community of investors getting interested in CDR, and we very much encourage them to come and talk to us, of course, as you hint. Um, and that's great, right? It's gonna take a village to make this happen. What's interesting about those sorts of LPs is they're not just coming to us saying we want to give you money. They're saying we also want to find ways to pilot these technologies or to learn from the startups in the ways that we reshape our companies. And it's very difficult for them to do that in house because this is a small community that's highly networked and very specialized. So a lot of our LPs are using our fund as a way to educate themselves, to identify pilot opportunities, to identify companies that they might want to acquire or invest in later. We're really happy to serve that purpose.
And would you say that's a good advice for funders to try and get a like an investor in your startup that's really a potential buyer or like someone that's really strategic? Like, is that a good idea to have a strategic partner as part of your cap table on CDR specifically?
That's a tricky question. It depends. I think in some sectors you have to be careful, bluntly, as to how quickly you get into bed with your potential future acquirer. And a lot of startups tend to be cautious about, whether they want to make those choices at their pre-seed or seed round, or whether that's something they'd like to bring in a later round, when the value proposition is a little bit clearer. It can be exciting and powerful to have a strategic at the table, and particularly, I think we've seen it offers a lot of pilot opportunities for those that are really engaged. But it can also be off-putting to other rival competitors, and that can help. That can make it more difficult to potentially really drive the market and get the best deal for your business. So I'd say it's horses for courses, and it's just one to think about hard. It can be powerful and it can be risky.
Well, I guess to continue on the topic of today, I'd love to talk a bit more about the startups that are building in that space. Because for now, we've really understood the part on like investing from your perspective. We understood a bit of the part on the LP side, but from a startup perspective, how do you define a resilient, potentially successful carbon removal company? What really excites you when you look at a project?
Yeah, I think resilience is an important ingredient. It's not the only trait we look for. But there is, I'd be wrong if I tried to pretend here that the CDR ecosystem is robust. It's still quite fragile. We're still looking at a small number of policies that could be repealed. We're still talking about a small number of key buyers who could drop out of the market. And we're still looking at a few dozen companies that dominate basically almost all the capital raised. So when something goes wrong, it it affects all of us, and that could be politics, like what's happening in the US at the moment, and everyone feeling very frightened as to, whether 45Q is safe or not. I think it is, by the way, but we'll see. Um, and we have had some kind of bad news in the last 12 months. We had, three big names in the industry that kind of went a little wrong. So we had Nori that closed down, and they were a real pioneer. We had Running Tide with some controversy, who ceased trading. And then we had Project Bison that was cancelled, mainly for operational reasons, but nevertheless, it was a big commitment that was pulled back. Um, and each time one of those things happened, um, I lost count of how many times I was asked, like, but what about Running Tide? And that was very damaging. Like, it was damaging for investor confidence. It was damaging, I think, reputationally for carbon credit sellers and buyers, probably. Um, I I guess so. So for me, a resilient company is one that's going to be able to get through these storms. Like, it's going to be a really long way from here to 2050. Companies that feel like startups need to feel like major, super boring scaled industrials by then. So their whole personality is going to need to completely change, and their talent is going to need to completely change, and their trading models and everything else is going to evolve so much. So we're talking about incredible flux. And I think a resilient company is one that is going to be able to get through that amount of change while staying true to itself and delivering, great product. Um, as I said to you earlier, like, I think the most resilient ones are going to be the ones that can also deliver value alongside carbon negativity. And that could be better food or healthier soils, better water, less PFAS. It could be a cheaper way of doing business. Could be lower emissions at the point source. It could be lighter, stronger, faster, better things. We're really open-minded about that. But in the long run, I think carbon negative practices should just become embedded in everything that we do. Why would you do something that didn't get rid of emissions if you could? We just have to find good economic sort of points where it sort of all fits together elegantly.
Yeah, and you said it's a very long timeline that you're working towards. with such a long timeline, what's the importance of storytelling there? Because obviously you have to sell a dream, a vision that's usually going to be 25 years long vision. Like, what's the importance of storytelling in that industry?
Storytelling matters, um, but first you have to do something good and right and proper underneath it. I've been in industries where storytelling was everything. I worked for some years in the media industry, and you could gloss over a lot of stuff if you were good at storytelling. CDR is not like that. Like, this was a bit of a shock to me when I first got involved in the industry, and I was mentoring some founders, and they sort of asked me a difficult question I didn't really know the answer to, and I tried to sort of bullshit my way out of it, and they just went, "Yeah, but what's the answer? Like, what do we do?" Um, this is an industry that calls a spade, that is scientifically driven, honest, direct, blunt sometimes, and that is critical. So, as I said, the health of the CDR ecosystem depends on those characteristics. We have to protect them. We cannot story tell our way out of problems. We have to face them. When we have problems with contamination, problems with social acceptability, problems with MRV, problems with acidification of waterways, problems with measuring bicarbonate ions in soil, we need to be honest about them. We have to tackle them. Once you've done that, once your fundamental science and technology is good, storytelling becomes really important because you have to be able to explain why what you're doing is good to a layperson who doesn't work in CTR. And I think this is a massive to do for our industry. There are companies in our portfolio that I think are world class that people still struggle to get their head around. Why would I want this? We have to explain the value proposition better and more simply. And unfortunately, it's not as simple always as cheaper. It's it might be cheaper and stronger and sooner, or more local. And explaining why the confluence of those benefits is helpful in particular situations and not others can be tough. So I think that's where storytelling really comes in, making complicated things simple without ever being dishonest, and trying to describe something as more mature or more proven than it really is.
Yeah, I think it's common across many scientific driven industries that storytelling matters for sure because you have to be able to tell the story, but definitely what matters most is like what's behind it. Like, is there really something? But look, Andrew, we are getting towards the end of this episode, and we have a section that we always do with all guests, which is a fire question. So we'll have approximately 10 questions in the next 5 minutes. You'll have one sentence, maybe two maximum to answer. Are you ready for that?
Hit me.
Okay, cool. What mistakes are first-time founders making in CDR?
Overestimating how much people care about CDR.
Oh, that's a good one. What's the most overlooked carbon removal technology right now?
It's not sexy, but it works, and it's a big scale opportunity in the short run. Anaerobic digestion plus CCS. So Bex with anaerobic digestion.
Super interesting. What's one thing carbon removal startups should stop doing in 2025?
It's the same answer as the first question, but they need to stop staying in the silo of CDR and navel gazing and thinking it's all about carbon removal. The world is big and complicated.
Are you excited about low-tech or nature-based solutions?
Yes, yes. Those two things do not go together, though. Low tech, nature based does not mean low tech. Quite the contrary. I think there's really interesting things that help trees go faster. That we don't even begin to understand what happens under the soil yet. It's the confluence of high tech and nature based that I think is exciting.
I love that. What's one bold bet that you've made that others thought was really crazy?
I think we went long on river and wastewater alkalinity enhancement when everyone else was going for the oceans. And I think we're pretty pleased about that choice.
Great, interesting. What's the biggest myth investors believe about carbon removal?
I think they think hardware doesn't pay and it's all about software. And I think that's completely wrong.
Is climate philanthropy?
Is climate philanthropy? No, absolutely not. All industry, all human activity will end up being about climate, and it will be impossible to make profit in the future unless you've planned for that and thought about it and built your business around it.
I love that. What red or green flags do you look for in a deck or pitches from a CDR company?
I think that there's the red and green flags are the same thing. and I'm going to call it doggedness. I think we need founders who are passionate, resilient, self-motivated, and able to take punishment because it's really hard. And I think you need that inner source of energy, that inner fire that drives you. But that also has a dark side, which is you need, you know, people like that can sometimes struggle to hear feedback, to listen to others. And I think when it gets into the realm of naivety and failing to hear that there's a problem, that doggedness goes into a massive red flag. And so I get a big red flag when a founder comes to me and says, "It's not fair. Nobody wants to invest in my company. They don't get it." That's the biggest red flag in the world, which is very close to I can see the future and nobody else can. Come join me, right? And so I think it's an interesting duality, which I'm still learning to process just right.
That makes a lot of sense. What should investors really look for in carbon removal deals today?
They really should look for a great business that happens to remove carbon.
I love that. What's the most exciting CDR tech right now and why?
Refer you back to my earlier point, but I think direct air capture solutions that are also capable of storing and releasing energy are really exciting.
Love that. If you had to start a CDR company tomorrow, what kind of company would you start?
I think that the space has matured to the point where I would be focusing on enablers more than, a siloed CDR company. I think there is massive opportunity space in developing new catalysts, in particular for CO2 hydration. So air contacting catalysts that help get CO2 out of gas streams or out of the air and into a solution where it can be dealt with. There's huge potential for innovation performance there. Similarly with solvent development, potentially gas separation membranes, like these spaces, there may be quite small things, the ingredient plays, but they're really big opportunities.
Yeah, I love that. What are the three most important things to be a successful impact VC or climate tech VC?
The most important thing is to be a good investor, irrespective of what your domain is, you know. Um, and um, and I really believe that. Like I think the word impact is loaded, and it's sort of I think in some places, particularly towards the around the turn of the decade, it was used as an excuse to not look at returns. I don't believe that's a sustainable behavior. It's great, it's philanthropic, but it's not investing. So be a good investor first. I think you have to be really clear on your objective. I struggle with a lot of diffuse fund objectives that are just like do better. For me, our North Star is really clear, and I use it every day. And it's actually a tool. It's not just something we put on our website. It's a bunch of filters that help us make good decisions. So we can triage 99% of opportunities right there and then. Um, and then I'd say, be a great listener. I think we're an arrogant industry. It's what we do. We sell our point of view, we sell our opinion, and LPs hopefully agree with it or get buy into it. So they hire us, but we're not always great at listening. And I think that's a really important behavior.
I love that. What's one advice for someone trying to raise an impact fund right now?
Good idea, bad timing. Um,
I know. For
and
sure.
do it 5 years ago. I think the idea of an impact fund to me is rather a dated concept anyway, like I just said. Not that I don't applaud the objective, but raise a fund that happens to have an impact.
I love that. Well, we got to the end of this episode. If people want to reach out to you, where can they find you online? What's the best way to reach out?
I'm super old fashioned, so I don't have anything other than LinkedIn and email, and those things work for me. But I do stay on top of both of those, so you can hit me up on LinkedIn if you can spell my surname. Otherwise, I'm Andrew dot Shebbeare at counteract.vc, and I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, lovely. I'll put that in the description of this episode. And one last question for you today. Who's the next person that should be in your seat for an interview?
I've got three ideas for you. Maybe you've done one before. I don't think you have. I think Hampus Jakobsen from Pale Blue Dot because he loves to poke the bear. I think Ben Tank from Marble, he's not officially a GP, but he can see the future. And Pippa Gawley from Zero Carbon Capital, because when I need a moment of grounding and common sense, she's the one I go to. She's just been a great guide for me, and I think she has a lot to say.
I love that. I will reach out. Well, listen, I think we'll learn a lot from you today, both on the investing side, also LP side, also on the startup side for carbon removal. I think it was very interesting talking to you. If you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review on your podcast platform, just like or comment on YouTube. That really helps us. So please do it. And yeah, if you want to share it with someone exploring carbon removal technologies or impact investing, please do as well. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you so much, you guys. It's been a real pleasure being on the show. And thanks for all of the deep thought that you've put into this. You really understand the space. It's obvious in your questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew.